He dropped out of school in the 6th grade. He lost over a dozen jobs across 2 decades. At 65 years old, he had no business, no savings, no prospects, and a social security check of just $105 a month. You would think that a man with no education, no money, no powerful friends, and a resume full of failures would simply accept defeat and disappear quietly into retirement, right? Well, Harlan Sanders managed to build one of the most recognized brands on the entire planet. He turned a fried chicken recipe cooked in the back of a gas station into a global empire with over 6,000 locations in 48 countries, generating $2 billion in annual sales by the time he died. He got there after 1,009 rejections. He got there sleeping in the back of his car, driving from town to town with a pressure cooker in his trunk. And he got there starting completely from scratch at an age when most people are focused on their grandchildren. So how did a poor Indiana farm boy, who couldn't even finish grade school, become the most famous chicken salesman in the history of the world? To find out, we have to go all the way back to September 9th, 1890. Henryville, Indiana, a 4-room farmhouse, 3 miles outside of a small town most Americans have never heard of. That is where Harlan David Sanders entered the world. And I want you to understand what that actually meant in 1890. This wasn't rustic charm, and this wasn't a romantic countryside childhood. This was poverty. Real, grinding, everyday poverty, where the harvest determined whether you ate well or barely ate at all, where medical care was a luxury, and where the future was not promised to anyone. His father, Wilbur Sanders, worked 80 acres of farmland with his hands every single day. After breaking his leg, Wilbur made the transition into town and became a butcher. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept the lights on and put food on the table. Harlan was the oldest of 3 children, and for the first 5 years of his life, things were about as stable as they were ever going to be for the Sanders family. Then, in 1895, Wilbur Sanders died. Harlan was 5 years old. His mother, Margaret, suddenly found herself alone with 3 young children and no source of income. She took whatever work she could find, eventually landing at a local tomato canning factory, where she peeled produce for long shifts at low wages. She did what she had to do to keep her family alive. But that meant Harlan, barely old enough to reach the top of a stove on his tiptoes, became the person responsible for cooking meals for his younger siblings every single day while his mother was away at work. You see, most people think Colonel Sanders discovered his love of cooking later in life, through some romantic culinary journey. But that is not the story at all. He learned to cook because he had to, because if he didn't cook, his little brother and sister went hungry. At 6 years old, Harlan Sanders was baking rye bread from scratch. At 7, he was frying pork chops and boiling vegetables for dinner every night. Local adults from neighboring farms would stop by just to taste what this remarkable child had made. They couldn't believe it. And that early praise, the genuine joy of feeding people, of watching their faces transform when they tasted something truly good, planted something deep in Harlan Sanders that would take 60 more years to fully bloom. But his childhood was about to get harder before it ever got easier. When Harlan was 12, his mother remarried. Her new husband, William Broadus, and young Harlan were simply incompatible in every way. The tension in the household became unbearable, and eventually, Margaret suggested Harlan leave home to preserve the peace in the new family. So he did. 12 years old, 6th grade education, no money, no real plan, just a kid who knew how to cook and was willing to do whatever physical work he could find. He took a job as a farmhand in Indiana, earning $15 a month plus room and board. Hard, physical labor from dawn to dusk. By 15, he had moved on to become a streetcar conductor in New Albany, Indiana. At 16, lying boldly about his age, he enlisted in the US Army and spent a year stationed in Cuba. When he came home from the military, he met a young woman named Josephine King in Jasper, Alabama, and they married in 1909. 3 children followed, responsibilities multiplied. The need for steady income became urgent and constant. Harlan Sanders was not short on ambition or energy. The man worked like a furnace, always moving, always generating heat, always searching for the next thing. But for 2 decades, he simply could not find his lane. Over the next 20 years, he would move through careers the way most people move through seasons. He worked as a railroad fireman on the Illinois Central Railroad, stoking coal into steam engines through the night. He studied law by correspondence course and qualified as a justice of the peace in Kentucky. He sold insurance in Jeffersonville, Indiana. He launched a steamboat ferry company on the Ohio River. He invested in a lamp manufacturing venture that sounded promising and quietly devoured most of his savings. He sold tires for Michelin until the company closed its New Jersey plant and eliminated his position overnight. He took a job as secretary for the Columbus, Indiana Chamber of Commerce. Each of these ventures carried its own version of the same story. Sanders would throw himself in completely, bringing real energy and genuine initiative. And then, something would go wrong. A public argument with a client that destroyed his insurance practice, a business partner who could not be trusted, an industry that simply was not ready for what he was trying to do. The Michelin layoff that came without warning. His wife Josephine, exhausted by the constant instability and the family's repeated moves across multiple states, eventually took the children and went to live with her parents. And through all of it, through every collapse and every painful restart, there was one thing Harlan Sanders kept returning to. One thing that never let him down. One thing that made him genuinely, consistently, deeply happy. Cooking. For his family, for his co-workers, for neighbors, for anyone who showed up hungry. Every time life knocked him flat and he needed to feed himself and whoever was around him, he would cook. And the food was always extraordinary. He just had not figured out yet that it was the answer he had been looking for all along. By 1929, Harlan Sanders was 39 years old and looking for his next move. A contact he had made through the Standard Oil Company offered him an opportunity to run a service station in Corbin, Kentucky, a small crossroads town tucked against the edge of the Appalachian Mountains along US Route 25, one of the major highways connecting the North and the South. Sanders took the deal. He moved to Corbin, set up the station, and started pumping gas. But then something almost accidental happened that would set the entire rest of his life in motion. Truck drivers and travelers stopping for fuel would ask Sanders where they could get a good meal nearby. And Sanders, being Sanders, had a better idea than pointing them somewhere else. He moved a table into the back of the station. He started cooking country ham, fresh biscuits, Southern-style vegetables slow-cooked all day, and fried chicken seasoned the way he had been making it since he was a boy back in that farmhouse in Indiana. He served customers in his own adjacent living quarters, where the table sat just feet from his own bed. Word spread faster than he could have possibly anticipated. Within months, people were not stopping at his station for gas anymore. They were stopping for the food. The gas was just the excuse. Sanders watched this happen and made a clear-eyed decision. He closed the gas station and opened a proper restaurant. He named it Sanders Court and Cafe. Eventually, he moved across the street to a larger location, room for 142 diners, a motel, and a service station all together. He was 40 years old, starting over again in yet another industry. Except this time, it was the industry he had been quietly preparing for his entire life. He did not coast on talent alone. Sanders enrolled in an 8-week course in restaurant and hotel management at Cornell University. He read everything he could find about running a successful food operation. He was meticulous about cleanliness, about consistency, about the quality of every single plate that left his kitchen. He understood that great food was only half the business. You needed systems. You needed standards. You needed to be able to replicate the experience every time, for every customer, no matter what. But he had a problem that nagged at him constantly, a practical kitchen floor problem that had nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with time. Traditional pan-fried chicken took 30 minutes or more to prepare properly. For a restaurant serving travelers who needed to get back on the road, 30 minutes was an eternity. Customers grew impatient, tables backed up, service suffered. Sanders needed speed without sacrificing the extraordinary quality that was drawing people to his cafe in the first place. He spent years working on this. He tested different cooking methods and different temperatures. He played with his blend of seasonings relentlessly, adding ingredients, removing them, recombining, starting over. He tried pressure cooking, which was a relatively new technology at the time, and realized immediately that it was the missing piece. A pressure fryer could cut his cooking time dramatically, while preserving every bit of the flavor and tenderness that made his chicken special. And then, in July of 1940, when Harlan Sanders was 50 years old, he finalized what would become one of the most fiercely protected recipes in culinary history. A blend of 11 herbs and spices cooked under pressure, producing chicken that was perfectly done in a fraction of the time. He called it his secret recipe. He memorized it completely and never wrote it down in any form that could be easily reproduced. And to this day, KFC guards that recipe in a vault in Louisville, Kentucky, with only 2 company executives knowing the full formula at any given moment. Things were finally moving. In 1935, Kentucky Governor Ruby Laffoon awarded Sanders the honorary title of colonel in recognition of his contributions to the state's culinary reputation. Sanders embraced that title and transformed it into one of the most powerful personal brands in American history. Then, in 1939, the influential food critic Duncan Hines visited Corbin and included Sanders' restaurant in his famous guide, Adventures in Good Eating. The entry praised the fried chicken, the country ham, and the biscuits, calling Sanders' place one of the finest stops on the road between the North and the South. Overnight, his cafe transformed from a regional favorite into a genuine destination. People were driving out of their way just to eat there. However, this success was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. In November of 1939, Sanders' restaurant and motel burned to the ground in a fire. Everything he had spent a decade building was reduced to ash and rubble in one night. Most men would have walked away. Harlan Sanders rebuilt. He borrowed money, found workers, and constructed a bigger and better establishment from the ruins. The new cafe was larger, with more seating, a better kitchen, and a proper motel alongside it. If there is one consistent theme running through every chapter of this man's life, it is that he did not stay down. He had been knocked flat too many times to believe a single disaster could define him. Business came back. The cafe grew. Then World War II arrived and systematically stripped his highway of customers. Gas rationing meant civilians were not traveling the way they used to. The steady stream of hungry travelers that had filled his tables every day began to thin, then disappear almost entirely. Sanders kept the doors open through the war years through sheer stubbornness, cutting costs wherever he could, serving the local community, waiting for better days. When the war ended in 1945, Sanders was 55 years old. He reopened fully and went back to work. The highway came alive again. Travelers returned. By the early 1950s, Sanders' Court and Cafe was well established, and the Colonel himself had become something of a regional celebrity. The famous food critic endorsement, the honorary title, the extraordinary chicken that people drove hours out of their way to taste. It seemed finally like the story had found its ending, a happy one right there in Corbin, Kentucky. Then the state of Kentucky announced the route for Interstate 75. The new highway would be modern, efficient, and fast. It would also completely bypass US Route 25 and completely bypass Corbin, completely bypass everything Sanders had built. The trucks and the families and the traveling salesmen who had made his business possible would all flow through a different corridor, and they would never drive past the Colonel's restaurant again. The business died slowly, then very quickly. Sanders put the cafe up for sale. The auction in 1956 barely covered his outstanding debts. He was 65 years old. He had just watched 20 years of work get liquidated for almost nothing. He was left with a Social Security check for $105 a month. That was it. That was everything. I want to stop right here because I think it is important to genuinely sit with this moment. Imagine you are 65 years old. You have spent your entire life working. You rebuilt from failure more times than you can count. You finally found the thing you were born to do. Built a real and flourishing business around it. Earned recognition and respect, and real customers who drove out of their way just to eat your food. And then, a highway bypass took it all away. Not a mistake you made, not a decision you got wrong. A highway built by the state. And now you are 65, broke, and living on $105 a month. By any rational measure, this is the end of the road. But Harlan Sanders loaded a pressure cooker and his secret blend of seasonings into the back of his car. He put on his black string tie and his suit, and he drove away from Corbin, Kentucky, with almost nothing, pointing himself at every restaurant he could find. His pitch was beautifully simple. He would show up unannounced. He would ask if he could use the kitchen and cook chicken for the owner. If they liked it, and they almost always liked it, he would propose a deal. They would sell his chicken using his recipe and his technique. In exchange, he would collect a royalty of 5 cents for every piece of chicken sold. Not a franchise fee, not an upfront investment. 5 cents per piece of chicken. That was all he asked, and they said no. Restaurant after restaurant, town after town, state after state. Some owners were polite about it. Some were dismissive. Some tasted his chicken, clearly loved it, and still turned him down because they did not want to change how their kitchen operated, or add a new cooking method, or deal with a pressure fryer they had never used before. Change is scary for any business, and Sanders was asking these owners to change something fundamental. The Colonel slept in the back of his car between stops. He stretched every dollar as far as it would go. He drove from Kentucky to Indiana, to Tennessee, to Alabama, to Georgia, and beyond, cooking for anyone who would let him through the door, and pitching his chicken to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear him out. There were days when he surely asked himself whether this was the right path, whether, at 65 years old, he was simply fooling himself. He had $105 a month from Social Security. He had the clothes on his back, a pressure cooker, and a sack of spices. He had no safety net and no backup plan. Every rejection meant another night in the car, another day of stretching thin resources, another mile on a road that did not seem to be going anywhere. And yet he kept going. Some historians believe the true number of rejections was even higher than 1,000, because Sanders did not keep a careful count. He was too busy driving to the next stop to dwell on the last one. What we know for certain is that the answer was no, over and over again. For years, he cooked in restaurant kitchens across the country, washed the dishes afterward when the owners let him, thanked them for their time, and walked back out to his car. 1,009 times, he was told no. I want you to really feel that number. Not just hear it, but actually feel what that means. 1,009 rejections spread across years of driving and cooking and pitching and being turned away. Most people quit after 5 rejections. The genuinely persistent ones might push through 50. 100 rejections would end most people's belief in themselves completely. But Harlan Sanders, at rejection number 500, was still getting in the car. At rejection number 700, he was still putting on that tie and walking through another restaurant door. At rejection number 900, he was still cooking because he knew the chicken was good. He had never doubted it for a single moment. And when you know something is genuinely, deeply, extraordinarily good, rejection is painful noise, but it is just noise. The answer is still out there. You just haven't found the right person yet. And then, in 1952, he drove to South Salt Lake, Utah, and walked into a restaurant owned by a practical businessman named Pete Harmon. Pete Harmon was not a dreamer. He was a working restaurateur who ran a tight, efficient operation and knew his numbers. When a 62-year-old stranger in a string tie showed up and asked if he could use the kitchen, Harmon could have said no. He had every reason to say no. But something about the Colonel's certainty, that absolute unshakable conviction that what he was about to cook was worth tasting, made Harmon say yes. Harmon watched Sanders prepare the chicken with practiced, unhurried precision. He smelled the herbs and spices filling his kitchen with an aroma unlike anything that had come out of those burners before. He tasted the finished product, and Pete Harmon understood immediately that this was something completely different from anything he had ever served his customers. The flavor, the tenderness, the perfectly seasoned crust with the moist, juicy interior cooked through by the pressure fryer. It was on another level entirely. They shook hands that day and made a deal. Harmon would pay Sanders a small royalty on every piece of chicken sold. A sign painter named Don Anderson, hired by Harmon to create promotional materials for the new menu item, came up with the name that would eventually conquer the world: Kentucky Fried Chicken. In the first year, Harmon's restaurant sales tripled. One recipe, one technique, one handshake deal with a 62-year-old man who had been sleeping in his car for years to make it happen. And a restaurant's sales tripled in 12 months. Word spread the way it always spreads about something genuinely extraordinary. Other restaurant owners heard what was happening in Salt Lake City. Some of the same people who had turned Sanders away years earlier started calling him back. The Colonel, who had spent years chasing restaurants, now had restaurants chasing him. He and his wife Claudia, whom he married in 1949 after divorcing Josephine, began mixing and shipping packages of the secret seasoning blend from their home in Shelbyville, Kentucky, to franchise locations across the country. Their house was simultaneously their home, their mixing room, their shipping department, and their headquarters. But here is what makes what Sanders actually built so remarkable, and so different from just being a good cook who got lucky. He was not selling a product. He was franchising a system. A precise, replicable, teachable set of techniques that any restaurant owner could follow and deliver the same extraordinary result every single time. The specific pressure fryer, the exact blend, the precise cooking time and temperature. Every variable was controlled, documented, and reproducible. This was the real invention, not just the recipe, the system that made the recipe scalable across the entire country. By 1960, there were over 200 Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise locations operating across the United States. The Colonel drove between them in a white Cadillac, checking standards, coaching owners, sampling chicken at every stop, and sending back anything that did not meet his exacting requirements. He was nearly 70 years old, and he was working harder than most 30-year-olds in the business. He did not care about comfortable retirement. He cared about every single plate of chicken going out of every kitchen that bore his name and his face. By 1963, 600 franchises were operating in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Australia. Kentucky Fried Chicken had become the largest fast food franchise in America, larger than McDonald's at the time. The Colonel upgraded from the white Cadillac to a gold Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud. He was wearing his signature white linen suit full-time now, his white hair and goatee grown out into the grandfatherly image that had become one of the most recognized faces in American commerce. He cultivated the image deliberately, accessorizing with a black string tie and a polished walking cane, letting his natural appearance evolve into something entirely unique. The Colonel was not just the brand ambassador for Kentucky Fried Chicken. He was the brand itself, the living, breathing, walking embodiment of everything the product promised: quality, tradition, warmth, and the insistence that things be done right. In 1964, John Y. Brown Jr., a young Kentucky businessman and future governor of the state, approached Sanders with an offer to purchase the entire Kentucky Fried Chicken Corporation. The price was $2 million, roughly $20 million in today's money. Brown included a lifetime annual salary of $40,000 plus commercial residuals. Sanders retained control of the Canadian operations and remained the face of the brand permanently. He signed the deal at 73 years old. $2 million, built on a 5-cent royalty per piece of chicken, built by a man who had been bankrupt a decade earlier, built by a 6th-grade dropout from a 4-room farmhouse who had failed at more careers than most people even attempt, built. The sale gave Sanders more freedom, not less. He became an even more visible and beloved public figure after selling the company, appearing in commercials, making personal visits to franchise locations around the world, signing autographs for customers who recognized that white suit from across a parking lot. Freedom. By 1976, he was ranked as the 2nd most recognizable public figure on the planet, behind only Richard Nixon. Think about what that means. A man who had once slept in his car, getting turned away from diners, was now one of the most famous human beings alive. Second, he never stopped fighting for quality. He was famously, hilariously, and very publicly unhappy with what KFC's corporate ownership was doing to his recipe. He called the new gravy goddamn slop with a wallpaper taste. He showed up to KFC restaurants without warning and critiqued the food out loud with zero apology or filter. He had spent his entire life battling to get the chicken right. He was not going to stop just because he had signed the papers. Sanders used his wealth generously in his final decades. He established charitable foundations. He donated to churches, hospitals, the Salvation Army, and the Boy Scouts of America. He adopted 78 orphans from overseas. A man who had lived on $105 a month at 65 was now one of the most philanthropic figures in American business, giving away enormous amounts of money with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. Generosity defined his later years. On December 16, 1980, Harlan David Sanders died of pneumonia in Louisville, Kentucky. He was 90 years old. He was buried at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, dressed in his iconic white suit and black string tie, looking exactly as the world had come to know him. At the time of his death, Kentucky Fried Chicken had over 6,000 restaurants in 48 countries, generating $2 billion in annual sales. Today, KFC operates over 24,000 restaurants in more than 145 countries. It is the second largest restaurant chain in the world, behind only McDonald's. And it was built by a boy from a 4-room farmhouse in Henryville, Indiana, who learned to cook at age 6 because poverty left him no other choice. Expansion on that scale came from very small beginnings. This is remarkable when you consider the full shape of this story. Harlan Sanders spent the first 39 years of his adult life failing at almost everything he touched. He was not a prodigy. He was not handed opportunity. He did not come from money or connections or the right schools. He had talent and he had relentlessness. And for decades, those two things combined were simply not enough to break through. The world was not particularly interested in what Harlan Sanders had to offer. Resilience alone would not explain what followed. Until one product, one perfect recipe, born from 60 years of cooking for people he loved, found its moment. Sanders said he had only had 2 rules: do all you can, and do it the best you can. It is the only way you ever get that feeling of accomplishing something. That philosophy sounds simple, but living it across a life as difficult as his requires something most people never quite find. It requires the belief that what you have is worth the fight, no matter how many times the world tells you otherwise. There is another line from Sanders that gets to the very heart of it. When he finally committed to franchising his recipe, someone asked why he kept going after so many rejections. His answer was direct. It came to me that the one thing I could do was cook, and I figured I couldn't do any worse than the people running these places around town. That is the mindset of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. And that, more than anything else in this entire story, is why he ultimately won. Today, over 1 billion people in more than 145 countries have eaten Kentucky Fried Chicken. The Colonel's face looks out from every one of those restaurants. White-suited, smiling, unmistakable. One of the most iconic brand identities ever created in the history of commerce. And the brand was simply himself. His own face, his own personality. The fully lived, deeply authentic image of a man who had failed and rebuilt and driven across the country sleeping in his car and simply refused to believe the story was over. Consider for a moment what it means to build a brand that outlives you by decades and still uses your face, your name, and your image to sell product in over 140 countries. Sanders did not hire brand consultants or commission focus groups to design his image. He simply became himself more completely than most people ever dare to. The white suit, the string tie, the walking cane, the goatee, the unapologetic southern directness, and the world found that image irresistible because it was real. People can always tell the difference, but Colonel Sanders' legacy is bigger than chicken and bigger than resilience. It is proof of something that most of us desperately want to believe but find very hard to trust. It is proof that it is never too late. The failures stacking up behind you are not evidence that you should quit. They are the education you needed to succeed. The recipe you have been developing your entire life might not find its moment until you are 65 years old and starting over with nothing. Harlan Sanders started building KFC at an age when most people have already stopped starting things entirely. He faced 1,000 rejections before his first yes. He built a global empire from a gas station kitchen in a small Kentucky town that most people have never been to, and most people will never visit. He proved, beyond any possible doubt, that a 6th grade dropout from a 4-room farmhouse has exactly as much right to change the world as anyone born into privilege, position, or circumstance. There is a reason this story gets told and retold. There is a reason that every discussion of entrepreneurial persistence eventually lands on the Colonel. It is not just the numbers, not just the 1,000 rejections or being 65 years old, or the 2 billion in annual sales. It is the complete picture. The dead father at 5, the cooking for siblings at 6, being 12 years old and leaving home, the 2 decades of failed careers, the fire, the war, the highway bypass. Every time a reasonable person would have stopped, Sanders found one more reason to keep going, and then one more after that. The only question is whether you get back in the car after rejection number 1008. He did, and that is why the whole world knows his name.